Bob, would you like to introduce our guest speaker for tonight?
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Sarah Towle is an educator, researcher, and writer, a human rights defender, nature lover, and vocalist. She resides in an ephemeral borderland, buffeted and buoyed by the diversity of languages, cultures, landscapes, and creeds. He has taught English language, literacy, cross-cultural communication, conflict resolution skills, and the writing craft 3 decades across 4 continents in a myriad of classroom contexts, including under the trees of refugee settings. It was family separation and kids in cages that drove Sarah to the border. On discovering the many-headed hydra that is the U.S. immigration complex, she could never look away again. And crossing the line, finding America in the borderlands, Sarah exposes layer by broken layer a system failing everyone, save the profiteers and demagogues who benefit from it. And yet, she finds hope. And in everyday acts of ordinary people who daily model a better way, amplifying their voices, Sarah urges us to act before we travel further down our current course. She has earned accolades in her pioneering interactive place-based taste for educational tourism. Within 1 week of publication, Crossing the Line, her first ever full-length book, joined the ranks of award-winning with a Gold Nonfiction Book Award from Nonfiction Authors Association. Ladies and gentlemen, the author, Sarah Towle. Ma'am, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me and making this opportunity available. I'm so thrilled to be with you all. I'm coming to you from Texas, where I'm on my multi-state tour, launching the book. It started in June, and at this point I have dates all the way up to Thanksgiving. So I'm thrilled that the book is resonating. Folks are interested in really understanding this issue, which has been so demonized and so catastrophized and so simplified by both political candidates as well as the media. So I'm hoping to bring a more nuanced and greater understanding to the issue. So as Bob said, I'm an international educator. I'm also an economic migrant, though I get to call myself an expat. I'm somebody who's made a career of offering welcome to newcomers and dignity to asylum seekers and refugees as an English language literacy teacher and writing coach. I've taught across the age span, as Bob said, including in El Salvador during the Dirty Wars. But I didn't really understand the depth of the brokenness of our immigration system until 6 years ago in June 2018, when the cries of 6-year-old Alison Jimena Valencia Madrid were heard around the world. I'm sure I'm not alone. I'm sure you heard it too. A small child made to memorize a phone number in a moment of panic when her mother realized they were about to be pulled apart. A 6-year-old made to grow up all too fast, begging a border official to please call my auntie, reciting the number over and over and over again. A 6-year-old through veils of tears while other children sobbed in the background. And their heartbreak was callously referred to as an orchestra without a conductor. Now, that 8-minute muffled recording, we believe, was taken from the pocket of a whistleblower inside the border prison in McAllen, Texas, euphemistically called a processing center, but in truth, it's a prison called Ursula. It was obtained by a Rio Grande Valley civil rights attorney who appears in my book, Jennifer Harbury. She passed it to journalist Ginger Thompson of ProPublica, who passed it to us. And when we all heard the Alison Jimenez cries, we rose up in collective outrage and we took spontaneous action. I'm sure you remember too, that in days we were marching under the banner of Families Belong Together all over the world, 750 demonstrations around the globe, 600 in the US alone. And on the 20th of June, 2018, the practice, at least that version of family separation was supposedly ended by presidential Sharpie. But the fact is, it never really ended, and it didn't really start with his administration. In my research, in fact, I would come to document 8 ways in which our immigration policies and practices separate families, and have done for decades across administrations on both sides of the aisle. But I didn't know that yet in June 2018. I had a lot to learn. But family separation was the inciting incident that propelled me to the border and propelled me on a journey across the 2,000-mile US-Mexico line from Brownsville to Tijuana, resulting in my book, Crossing the Line, Finding America in the Borderlands. The book begins in a refugee encampment just across the Rio Grande from Brownsville, Texas, in Matamoros, Mexico, where I discovered 3,000 of 70,000 people who'd been thrust into homelessness on the threshold of the world's richest nation by the leader of the free world. And the book ends on 2 mass deportation flights, the likes of which one of our current candidates promises to make a daily fact of life if given another crack at the White House. Some people have likened this book to a cross between Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness and Cheryl Strayed's Wild, though the journey of discovery in this case is not between me and my biological mother, but me and my motherland. I think it's pretty apt. On this journey, I had many, many mentors and guides, folks who, like me, once compelled to bear witness to the human costs of our immigration system, could never ever look away again, which is why I like to say that Crossing the Line was written not by me, but through me. It holds up to the light the tales and voices of roughly 100 people, including those of individuals caught under the knee of this cruel system, but also the stories of the first responders who are tirelessly waging a grassroots war of welcome. I weave their oral testimonies into historical markers and milestones essential to ground their tales in greater context and give them broader meaning. And into those 2 strands, I braid the journey of my awakening to a world that I didn't really perceive before June 2018, but whose creation, it turns out, began right around the time of my birth, grew up all around me, all around all of us, hiding in plain sight. It was just outside my privileged view. So the inciting incident was family separation, and the threshold, the world that I crossed into on arriving at the border, I call the border industrial complex. My first learning, once inside this previously unknown place, was that it did not begin with the Trump administration. Indeed, they had merely been enabled by many administrations before them to crank the cruelty of the system to 11, but the cruelty was not theirs alone. Other specters I encountered inside the border industrial complex include a bipartisan project dating back decades to extend our borders across oceans and deserts and deep into others' national territories as a way to make end runs around the 1951 Refugee Convention, which is the international treaty body governing asylum protection, and the 1980 Refugee Act, which US administrations began to flout even before the ink had dried on what should be the law of the land. I discovered a 100-mile policing zone that encircles the entire country, not just the southwest border. It emanates inward from coasts and up and down from land borders. It subsumes 2/3 of the US population, 9 of our 10 largest cities, and 6 whole states by my count, as well as the District of Columbia. This zone is the jurisdiction of a 60,000 member force and counting that knows no transparency and suffers little accountability. I'm speaking of Customs and Border Protection, which includes the Border Patrol, who, owing to a series of dubious 1970s Supreme Court decisions, have the right to patrol via racial profiling, which we might not feel, or I might not feel as a white woman with blonde hair and blue eyes, but it still compromises all our constitutional protections under the 4th and 14th Amendments. Their counterpart is a 20,000 member force and counting, which you all know as ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. ICE polices the interior out inside that 100-mile policing zone in collaboration with local police, and it too knows no transparency or accountability, though its routine acts of violence, brutality, and impunity are legion, and at this point very well documented. The world of the border industrial complex also includes 200 plus ICE prisons, 80% of which are run by for-profit companies, for-profit contractors paid with our tax dollars to lock up as many as 41,500 peace-seeking people every day. These are people who've committed no crime, and yet they are shackled, thrown into orange jumpsuits, and thrown into jail for money. It includes a for-profit transportation machinery of buses and armored jails on wheels and airplanes and restraining devices that whisk peace-seeking people away, and along with them, ICE agency crimes in daily expulsion missions that return them enchained to the very harms and fears they fled. And in this world, our legal obligations on the part of folks seeking safety play out every day in kangaroo courts, which have so compromised the promise of due process under the law that one immigration judge once likened her job to hearing death penalty cases in traffic court settings. The entire Rube Goldberg of the border industrial complex, which is now worldwide, which encircles the globe like a second equator and has created a kind of global apartheid, was built, I discovered, on the foundations of a single theory. That theory is called prevention through deterrence, what I prefer to call deterrence through cruelty. And it posits that if we make northward migration as dangerous and difficult and painful and perilous as possible, those who survive it, and many don't, will send word back home. Do not come. Do not come. So this is, as it is October, and I was asked to talk about important immigration anniversaries in the month of October. This is the first one. It is now 30 years old, enacted on October 1st, 1994, 9 months after NAFTA. And because and it's documented, the State Department recognized that the free trade agreement signed into law on January 1st of that same year would cause human displacement. So while NAFTA opened the borders to goods and money, Operation Gatekeeper on October 1st, 1994, closed the border to people. Operation Gatekeeper was built on this theory that if we make it really, really painful, people will stop coming. And it kickstarted the militarization of our southwest borderlands. But prevention through deterrence has been an abject, miserable failure these 30 years. Why? Because for as long as there have been people on the planet, we have moved. It's part of our human story. We move away from harm, horror, hunger. We move toward better. We move toward opportunity, as in my case, which I've done for the whole of my career. So it looks pretty hopeless and it is pretty deathly, but still in this world, I found hope. I found hope in the mentors and guides I mentioned before that you will meet in my pages. They represent the ordinary folks all across the United States, including right there in Queens, even all over New York, which is part of the Borderlands, who express daily acts of extraordinary kindness in the face of what I believe is a manufactured humanitarian crisis. These are folks who show us every day that there is a better way, that we can welcome newcomers with dignity and still have safe borders, and that we'd be a much better nation for it. So these are the people I believe are providing the answers to this current seemingly intractable situation. I try to avoid the word crisis at the border crisis, because I do believe it's a manufactured crisis created for the cameras to whip up a moral panic in order to distract us from the real problems facing both our nation and the world today. In fact, I conclude that the real crisis at our borders is not the numbers of people coming, but the hardening of the human heart, our cruelty in the face of their hope for a better future for themselves and their children. So the first responders waging the war of welcome model for us who I believe we can be, who we should be, and who we must be. A nation willing to offer welcome with dignity to folks who've had to pull up stakes and run, not because they want to. I mean, nobody wants to go through the Darien Gap. Nobody wants to ride the back of La Bestia. Nobody wants to put their child in a dinghy and set out across the Caribbean Sea or walk across the Sonoran Desert with a single jug of water. Nobody wants that. They're doing it because their homes have been turned into the mouths of sharks, in large part due to our foreign and economic policies dating back decades and centuries. So what I learned through writing this book is that the borderlands are everywhere. New York is in the borderlands right now. The militarization of our borderlands did not begin with 9/11, but 9/11 really turbocharged it and gave us the excuse to develop the Department of Homeland Security. Nor is the system broken, as pundits and politicians would have us believe. It is working just fine, as Bob read, for the demagogues and profiteers who benefit from it, which is why we've seen no human-centered reform to this system in almost 4 decades. And although it isn't necessarily felt again by people like me with blonde hair and blue eyes, it is compromising us all. It is trouncing our values as members of a democratic society. It is trouncing the values of members of communities of faith. So that's why I wrote the book. When I realized that if I didn't know the many-headed hydra in our midst, someone who's made a career of working with refugees and offering welcome to newcomers, then a lot of other people like me don't know as well. And I truly believe that when they do, when you do, you'll all be outraged too. And as we discovered with family separation, with that level of outrage comes action. And it is going to take all of us, just as we brought family separation supposedly to an end. It's going to take each of us playing our own little part, emulating the heroes in our midst, to grow a large chorus singing loud and long in glorious harmony that this is not the nation we want to be, that we are better than this. So the book is an expose, but it is also a call to action and a handbook for a more humane world, as well as an invitation to join the chorus if you haven't already. My hope is that when you read the efforts of the 100 voices that are included in the book, that at least one will cause your heart to beat a little faster than the rest, and that's the model, that's the example you choose to help us get to work. Because no matter how the election goes in November, we're gonna have to get to work and mobilize before January 21, 2025. My hope too is that in applying pressure on our elected officials, applying pressure on Congress, that we can be, in the words of Ronald Reagan, the beacon of hope. But right now we're really falling short of that goal. So that's it for my presentation. I can do a reading now, or I can talk you through some of the additional October immigration anniversaries. In fact, what do you say? You tell me, and then we'll take Q&A.
I'd be interested in some of the history,
Sure.
Sarah, before you might do a reading.
Sure, absolutely. So I mentioned October 1st, that's Operation Gatekeeper, when the border was closed to people and when the wall really began. So it started in Imperial Beach, California. You might have seen, if you haven't seen it in person, you may have seen the wall that's all graffitied. It's been taken down now and replaced by President Biden, but it used to go right out into the ocean. and split Tijuana from San Diego, or from San Isidro. That border wall began right around 1994, and it began to make its way east over the course of time. That original wall was made out of landing pads from, or some of it was made out of landing pads from the Vietnam War, recycled to build a border wall. So that's a big date. Another big date, October 3rd, was the Hart-Celler Act, or the what is it called? Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965, signed into law by Lyndon Johnson. Now, this was supposed to be a really positive move. It was meant to undo the laws that were put into place in 1924 at the time of at the beginning of the Border Patrol, when the United States created the Border Patrol. Now, the Border Patrol we know today was not the first Border Patrol. I'll come back to that. But 1924, Border Patrol was created to enforce the National Quotas Act. And that was a law that was completely and utterly xenophobic. It was a backlash reaction to 40 years of migration from Southern and Eastern Europe, back in the days when Italians and Jews were not considered white. And, you know, by the 20s, we had something called the, oh gosh, I'm blanking, the Higgin, I'll look it up. We had these scientific studies that proved, right, that that Northern Europeans were smarter than Southern Europeans, that there were different races of human being, and that science was used by Congress to enact the National Quotas Act, which tied migration going forward, or the ability to migrate. It created caps and quotas linked to national origin that were linked to the 1890 census. So in other words, in the era when Northern Europeans were coming over and settling in the United States, those were the people that could still come. And by being tied to a census that predated mass migration from Southern and Eastern Europe, it was deliberately done to ensure a whiter United States. So by the civil rights era, it was pretty clear that that was discriminatory and racially motivated. And so there was a lot of action among the Kennedys and others in Congress to repeal the National Quota Act and create the Hart-Celler Act. Now, the Hart-Celler Act had some unintended consequences, or maybe they were intended, who knows, because it put a priority on family reunification, which became what we know now today to be called chain migration. So that too actually privileged folks that were already in the United States, already from Northern Europe, already primarily white. But it also gave us more folks coming over from Asian countries and from African countries, from South American countries. So it did begin to change the racial and national makeup of the United States, propelling us into yet another xenophobic wave, which we're living through today. So many people say that though the Hart-Celler Act of 1965 was meant to be a repeal of obvious discrimination, it too has produced this 40 years of changing in the makeup of identities in the United States that has led to yet another xenophobic backlash. So here we are 100 years later, kind of reliving history again. Another Another October anniversary that I want to highlight, and which is linked to the reading that I will offer you today, took place 4 years ago on October 12th, 2020. In that era, we were in the middle of the pandemic, right? And we had a very xenophobic president who had either lobbed people back across the border and stuck them there in cartel-controlled northern Mexico, where they were preyed upon and thrust into homelessness, or he just kept them trapped inside ICE prisons throughout the pandemic, not letting them out. I have interviewed hundreds of people, and across the board, the word is in ICE prison, the darker the skin, the worse you have it. And in that era, during the pandemic, we did see that folks who were allowed their freedom tended to be Latinx and African nationals seeking asylum were not let out. And there was a particular community from the West African country of Cameroon that began to show up at the US southern border in 2017. Bad luck for them. But the reason is, there were two reasons. The one is that in 2016, so Cameroon is split. It's a binational, bicultural country, but the promise of it being a country based on equality was betrayed from the very beginning, and the Francophone population discriminates against and marginalizes the Anglophone part of the population. And the Anglophones have been kind of pushing back against this since that betrayal happened, which was right around the time of the Hart-Celler Act, a little bit earlier in the early 1960s. They became very organized over the years, and in 2016, they rose up in a peaceful civil rights movement, very much like our own civil rights movement, right? They took to the streets with signs, very peacefully, no arms, brought out the children, brought out the wives. It started with lawyers and teachers, but then everybody came out into the streets. And it was a peaceful protest of their marginalization. And the president at the time, he's still president today. There's only been 2 presidents in Cameroon, and this one is 90 years old, and he's been president for 40 years. His name is Paul Biya. He reacted with violence, with tanks, with guns, kind of a Tiananmen style reaction to peaceful protest. And a lot of these Anglophone civil rights organizers were rounded up, imprisoned, tortured. A lot of them had to be bribed out, and they fled. Now, at that time, the normal route, or the historic route for folks seeking safety out of Africa, was to go to Europe. But at this point, in 2017, Fortress Europe had also put the brakes on migration. European Union was already paying Libya and Tunisia and Morocco to keep folks in search of safety from migrating across the Mediterranean Sea, with terribly deathly results. So the Cameroonians went to South America. At that time, the only visa they could get was Ecuador. So they all flew to Ecuador, and then they walked. They walked up through Colombia, across the Caribbean Sea, into the Darien Gap jungle of Panama, and then into Costa Rica, Nicaragua, et cetera. All of them hoping to reach the promised land, the beacon of hope. And when they finally got to the United States in 2017, because it took some months for them to make this journey, to the one they were shocked to say, I'm here to request asylum from persecution, only to be shackled, hands and wrist cuffs, ankles manacled, everything tied into a waist chain, thrown into a jumpsuit, and thrown in prison. They were not let out, and they were only sort of presumptively given access to due process under the law. And then when the pandemic hit and Title 42 kept everybody from crossing at the southern border, the ICE did not let its prisoners out, even though prisons were turning into death traps. So the prisoners revolted. They went on hunger strike. They protested their incarceration. They weren't given masks. They weren't given hand sanitizer. They reached out to attorneys and advocates and journalists, whomever they could reach. And of course, the Cameroonians were in a good position to do this because they're English speaking. So they took on this leadership role, and they were also being civil rights organizers. They were organized. So they became the target of retribution. And there are all kinds of stories of them being pepper sprayed in the eyes, thrown into solitary confinement without their clothes, temperatures turned down to frigid 50 degrees, no mattress, no water, having to drink out of the toilet. This is in the United States of America. Some of them were a lot of them were separated. Well, long story short, in the waning months of the Trump administration, we started to see, we were doing a deportation watch. Why? Because when commercial traffic, air traffic was grounded, we could very easily see the routes that ICE Air was taking, the planes that they were using, the charter air companies that were contributing to this machinery. And a colleague of mine began to really just track it just for the purposes of archiving the data. And we began to see patterns. And one of the patterns we began to see is that ICE was corralling African nationals and deporting them in mass deportations on big planes, come right out of an airfield just a few miles away from me here in Texas, in Fort Worth. And the first plane to remove Cameroonian asylum seekers lifted off on October 12th, 2020, which was Indigenous Peoples' Day, so that attorneys could not get emergency stays of removal from the courts because the courts were closed because it was a national holiday. And then there was a second flight again on November 11th. Same thing, Veterans Day, attorneys couldn't get emergency stays of removal. In those two flights, 4 years ago, roughly 83 people were returned to Cameroon. And not only were they returned to their persecutor, but ICE then gave their persecutor all of their confidential asylum documents, which made them traitors to their country and put quite a few of them back in jail, maybe even in front of a firing squad. A lot of them had to flee again. So that at that time, I decided as a research project that I would try to track down as many of the 83 people as I could find and get their testimonies and find out why they were retaliated against and what really happens on an ICE Air deportation flight. So in my book, this is potentially the only document available to the public right now that describes what happens on roughly 100 planes every month, affecting roughly 11,500 people every month. That's the reading I would like to offer you today, if that's okay. Ready? All right, here goes. Just as a preamble from the previous chapter, I write, if you've been wondering how such a massive operation as the US deportation machine can grow so big and remain so hidden for so long, this is how. It exists between the cracks, churning away at odd hours and in out-of-the-way places, where even a Boeing 767 wide body can lift off without notice, unless you know what you're looking for. On September 30th, we were handed a massive clue when Omni Air International, tail number N207AX, took off from a private airport in Fort Worth, Texas, called Alliance Field. A hub for FedEx and Amazon, Alliance Field mainly serves cargo operations and defense contractors. The Omni Air International is a Department of Defense troop mover, but this flight made multiple stops in Africa, Senegal, Liberia, and the Côte d'Ivoire, returning to Senegal before touching down in Ghana, places that had little connection to US Army bases. The pattern gave credence to our hunch that ICE was rounding up African origin individuals seeking asylum and removing them en masse in the waning months of the Trump administration. And sure enough, there were one or two of these big mass deportation flights from August through to January of 2021. The final flight that tried to lift off and return on yet another group of Cameroonians back to harm was stopped by DHS Secretary, Department of Homeland Security Secretary Mayorkas, 30 minutes after his swearing in. The plane was on the tarmac, they were about to lift off, he was sworn in and he stopped the plane. So that was a big Hollywood ending, and he did that because of our advocacy to try to get it stopped. But with regard to the October flight and the November flight that follows, this is what I learned about what happens on a ICE air deportation flight. Be advised, the rest of this narrative could be triggering. What follows is one of two public accounts that I know of that describes what happens on over 100 ICE air flights every month, impacting nearly and monthly estimated average of 11,500 individuals. As I am not one of the directly impacted persons whose horrors I've been permitted to share here, I can only imagine the terror and humiliation they felt based on the experiences they shared with me. I therefore must ask you to imagine too. If you've ever been on a long distance economy class flight, you will know that the body fatigues from sitting in the same position for too long. Those seat backs recline, it's challenging for many to rest with knees bent and legs dangling. The joints swell, both from inaction as well as from the cabin's lower than normal humidity, which sucks moisture from the tissues and cells, causing dehydration. Shoes become uncomfortably tight, hands lose their grip. Even a 6-hour journey across the continental US can be taxing to the lower back, hips, knees. Now imagine being forced to fly across half the US as well as the Atlantic Ocean with your ankles in manacles, your hands bound in cuffs and tightly tied to a waist chain. Imagine the links of the waist chain planting themselves in your spine and back muscles. Imagine not being able to shift or adjust them because you were bound for 16, 20, 24, 36, even 48 hours. In the case of the botched Omni Air International flight to Somalia, documented in Shackled by Rebecca Sharpless. Imagine sitting for 16 hours to Douala, Cameroon, your ankles and hands swelling, causing the metal hardware to pierce your skin and eat into your nerves. You are unable to kick off your shoes and shake off the wrist guards. You are unable to reach the button to push your seat back to relieve the pressure on your hip joints. Imagine your panic in a moment of turbulence when you realize that in the event of an emergency, you will not be able to place over your nose and mouth the oxygen mask that drops from above. You will not be able to grab a life buoy. You will not be able to open the hatch if the aircraft lands on water. You will not be able to grab a life buoy or to tread water in the event you must deplane in a hurry. You will not be able to hurry. You will be helpless. Imagine being fed nothing but stale white bread and potato chips. Imagine being forced to bend over like a dog to eat the tasteless, salty fare because your chains are so tight you cannot bring your hands to your mouth to feed yourself. Imagine not wishing to eat like a dog and going without for 16 hours, maybe more. Imagine your mouth and nose so parched, the natural human act of breathing causes you pain. Imagine hours passing before anyone offers you water. Now imagine being physically unable to raise the plastic bottle to your bone-dry lips and throat. To get a drink, recounts Oscar, you had to squeeze both your hands around the container to push the water out of the top and try to catch a little on your tongue. Imagine not being allowed to go to the bathroom without the escort of an armed guard. Imagine having to shuffle your way down the aircraft aisle in manacles and chains with a bladder full to bursting, only to find when you reach the cabin restroom that the guard refuses to close the door. It is impossible, of course, to lower zipper and trousers with your hands enchained. Imagine missing and soiling yourself. Imagine your escort erupting in laughter, shaming you. Imagine returning to your seat, made to sit in your own urine and feces. Imagine being a menstruating woman denied a fresh pad or given one but unable to apply it to soiled panties with bound hands. Imagine even wanting to try with the toilet door left open and a male guard peering in, laughing. Imagine. Imagine that for 16 hours or more, no one has cleaned the toilets. The November death plane did not touch down in Luanda, Angola for 34 hours and 40 minutes after takeoff from Alliance Field. Imagine being enchained for that long in a cabin, overpowered by the stench of human excrement. Imagine trying desperately to hold it, but finally giving into the call of nature, and the stench being so bad your body takes over. You pee in your pants as you retch, adding to the unholy mess. I'm told it wasn't just the raw essence of human waste, moreover, that infused Omni-Air International N207AX. There was the constant sobbing of passengers, the ceaseless yelling of guards dressed for war and toting guns, and the odor of nervous, panicked sweat. Again, quoting Oscar, it was torture. You could smell the trauma. Oscar wasn't the only one to say so. The 4 dozen plus testimonies I collected from those forced into this ice air torture chamber collectively describe a flying Abu Ghraib. So that was October 12th and November 11th, 2020, another anniversary. And then the final anniversary I'll call to mind, which is a much happier one, is October 28th, being National Immigrants Day. So there we go.
That's a lot to absorb. It really is. One of our attendees did have to leave, and he did note in the chat, thank you for this interesting program. I just, if anybody has a question or comment they'd like to plop into the chat, you're welcome to, or you can unmute yourself and ask. I wanted to ask, through my lifetime, I've seen movies about the horrors of immigration and migrants' experiences in our country, but also in other countries. I recall like an Australian film about, the separation of families, etc. Is there any country in the world that does it well?
Not right now. We did have an amazing example by Angela Merkel when she was Chancellor of Germany. And during the Syrian war, millions of people were displaced and they came across the Mediterranean Sea and into Italy. And she said, come on up, come on to Germany. You might remember the footage of people walking along the Autobahn, and Hungary didn't want them, so they bust them through. In those days, the model that the German public showed us was actually pretty good. I mean, it wasn't great for everyone, but they created these big shelters with, I don't know if you've ever been I walked the Camino with my daughter, and some of the refugio that we stayed in reminded me of what it might have been like in Germany during this time, where they took these big stadiums and then created like cubicle apartments. So you were living en masse, but you had a little private space where you could hang up your clothes, and you had a nice bed, and they were allowed to come and go. It wasn't a prison. They were given work permits. They were allowed to go out and look for jobs, and they were eventually assimilated all over the country, and really actually helped to revive the German economy at that time. So, you know, there were a couple of bad experiences that were, of course, hyped up by the right-wing media, and that led to the backlash, the xenophobic march of fascism that we see today, not only in Europe, but in the United States. So unfortunately, it was a great example, but the consequences have not been great. But it is an example. It's something we can look to. But that is why I say that our mentors, our teachers, have to be the folks right around us, right? Because there is no country doing any better right now, which is why I say we've created a kind of global apartheid. But right there in New York, you have Team TLC NYC that's meeting people at the bus stations, particularly when Greg Abbott started trafficking folks from Texas up to New York to make a point. And Eric Adams really was not up to responding with dignity. Folks on the ground did. You've got Team TLC meeting buses. You've got the ROCC. I can't remember what that stands for. It's something like resources. I don't remember, but it's in like Baptist Metro Church. You've got the Migrant Center at St. Francis Assisi in the Port Authority area. You've got Redef Shalom, congregation on the Upper West Side that's doing the coordinated pro bono legal advisement. So, and you've got up in the Hudson Valley, you've got the Grannies Respond, who are doing really phenomenal work. So yeah, our answers are in the heroes, the everyday heroes committing extraordinary acts of kindness every day, despite being vilified, despite being criminalized in Texas by Greg Abbott, for example. But they are, I think, the folks we should be looking to.
I can recall when I was back in high school, when we had actually a discussion when they were redoing the Immigration Act. And I'll never forget the statistics that permitted arrivals from England was like 20,000. And from the Philippines was like 300. And it was like, you know, what's wrong with this picture?
Right.
And that was something you never forget. By the same token, there's, you know, I do get subscribe to The Economist, and I go online, see what's happening in Europe, particularly in Germany. And there's been a huge reversal of desire for immigration. What do you think has triggered that? And how can things be set back positively? Like some sort of comments on that. You know, we're reading this stuff. What is your answer to what we're reading? Why is it there? And how can it be changed back to something a little bit more positive?
Well, I think to answer your the answer is sort of easy, but not easy. I mean, it's easy to say it's a xenophobic backlash, and then that is what it is. The narrative that is in the zeitgeist of criminals and perverts and diseased people coming in, you know, invaders coming for your wives and your jobs. It's not the first time in history that we've heard these tropes. It's not the first time in history that one particular nation group has been accused of eating other people's dogs and cats, right? Vietnamese were accused of that when they came over in the 70s following the Vietnam War. The Chinese were accused of that in the xenophobic backlash of the transition to the 20th century. So these are tropes that have been trotted out time and again by folks who believe in the fallacy of white supremacy and who are worried about being replaced. The great replacement theory that we hear about if you happen to listen to Fox News, it's alive and well, but it's not a new thing. It was written about by a French racist who's quite celebrated named Raspail in his book Camp of the Saints. Camp of the Saints was a fictional novel, but it depicted the overtaking of Northern Europe by swarthy immigrants coming up from Africa and the Middle East. And it is the Bible of the white supremacist movement in the United States today, republished by a group called the Tanton Network that I write about in my book, who, also feared the arrival of Latinx and Asian immigrants back in the 80s and early 90s. The Latinx refugees were a response to our creating wars in Central America in particular, and creating our wars created refugees. And those refugees were shut out because the wars, the governments that were brutalizing the people were our allies. And so, no, you couldn't come in. If you were Cuban, you could. If you were Nicaraguan, you could, because those were Cold War foes. But if you were El Salvadoran, even though we were spending $1 million a day on that war, you were not considered a refugee. So it's easy to say that it's racism, it's discrimination, it's a xenophobic backlash based on the fallacy that white Northern Europeans are smarter and better and a different race of human being. But I wish it were that easy, because one of the things that I discovered in my book is that when you go into these ICE prisons, the jailers look just like the jailed. They don't look like the good white good old boy of one's imagination of films, right? Like In the Heat of the Night, for example. Isn't that the Sidney Poitier movie? Isn't that what it's called? You know what I'm talking about. They are Latinx, a lot of them, and they're jailing Latinx, and they all have the same last names. So it was a dynamic that I really struggled to understand. And I found a lot of answers in the book of Isabel Wilkerson, Caste. She writes about how we're not really dealing with racism anymore. We're dealing with casteism, because and it's this hierarchical system that, again, goes way back to the era of enslavement, where the field slave didn't have as much power as the house slave, and the house slave was willing to kick the field slave to the curb. That's the same dynamic we saw during the Holocaust, of the Jewish capo doing the bidding of his white captor, even though it might have meant the death of his Jewish brethren. So these are human psychosocial dynamics that play out again and again and again in our history. So how do we push back against that? It isn't going to be easy, but I think one way we do it is we educate ourselves so that we can say, no, that's not true. Right now, we live in a world where our national discourse, whether it's on the far right or in the mainstream media, because let's face it, on this issue, we've been moving so far to the right, so far to the right, so far to the right for so long that there is no middle on the issue anymore. Even Kamala Harris sounds right-wing on this issue. So the national narrative has conflated asylum seeking with illegality. Asylum is never illegal. It's everybody's right under the 1951 Refugee Convention to request protection from persecution anywhere they want to, no matter how they arrived, no matter how many countries they passed through. And it is the obligation of the nation to which that petition has been made to adjudicate and check into that claim. So what Northern European or what global North societies are doing is figuring out how to stop people from setting foot on US soil or European soil or Australian soil, so as not to have to abide by these conventions. It's also written into the 1980 Refugee Act. 1980 Refugee Act. In 1980, we had the Mariel boat lift. Afro-Cuban and Haitians set sail from Mariel, Cuba. They landed in Miami. First Carter and then Reagan didn't want all these people. So that kicked off the development of our for-profit prison system. It began then in reaction to, Black people coming across in large numbers. We also have to realize that 120, that was 125,000 people. That's not that much. We allowed 500,000 Ukrainians to enter through the San Isidro port of entry in about a week's time, and nobody said boo. And they're dispersed all over the country and assimilating just fine right now. So it does reek of a racialized mentality, mindset that's been with our country since the era of enslavement and since the Native American genocide. We have to understand that. We have to push against that. We have to educate ourselves about it so we can educate others. And we also have to realize and understand how our institutions, particularly the Department of Homeland Security, which I describe in one of the chapters of my book, are built on these same systems. So when people talk about systemic racism, this is what we're talking about. We've got these systems that were built on this model. And even if we don't believe that we're a racist nation anymore, our systems really are. So we need to recognize that, dismantle them, rethink how we're going to manage this situation, because it isn't going away.
One thing I've learned studying history is that it's really difficult to predict the human animal, how it will behave, what direction it will head. And one of the things that us historians are noticing is that the new immigrant population, as it becomes more established, is here longer, becomes increasingly right, increasingly religious, increasingly family oriented. And it's, and increasingly Republican voters. And so it's really interesting, to see how things are emerging. And I think that the future of this country is going to look very different, but in a very different way than most people think today. And you've seen it in the past. I mean, when people came from Europe in the early 1900s, the Italians became very religious and very conservative and very whatever. The same with the Eastern Europeans. So I see the same. I look at everything very positively. I should say this is reinvigorating the country. This is this we used to read in book of 100 years ago. We're seeing it in the streets of New York today. So
Yes.
I think if those dimensions are maybe discussed, but of course the voting habits, maybe the right doesn't or the left doesn't want to discuss this. I don't know, but I just find it so ironic that things will turn out far better, I think, than what we hope if these trends continue.
I think to your point about newcomers becoming right, that's another example of this dynamic of the newcomer, kicking those coming behind them off the ladder. And if we were to change our ways and become more welcoming and embrace folks and not make them fight so hard for the dignity that should be theirs by right, we might not be forcing people into taking on this this long established pattern of needing to claw themselves up the ladder and kick back those coming up behind. There are many examples in our history where if only we'd offered welcome, things might have turned out differently. And one example that comes immediately to mind is, again, going back to the Dirty War era and the Salvadoran War, right? That was when when we shut the doors, when the Reagan administration shut the doors to El Salvadoran refugees, that created in, capitalist concept of, or phenomenon of supply and demand, created the need for human trafficking. There wasn't human trafficking across the border until then. And then once we had, unleashed this need for people to sneak in, they couldn't be in the country sort of knowingly, so they were pushed into marginalized neighborhoods, very impoverished neighborhoods. And in the case of the Salvadoran refugees, a lot of them young kids who were fleeing the death squads, they were pushed into East LA, which was very poor and was already sort of run by gangs, the Asian boys and the Bloods and the Crips and the Mexican mafia. So they were picked on and bullied, and nobody, wherever they turned, they were not accepted. They couldn't go to good schools. They had very little opportunity. The people who were taking care of them worked 100 jobs and were commuting all the time. So they bonded out of sheer necessity, and their little cliques became a gang, or club became a gang, and their fists turned into knives, turned into guns. Petty crime led to prison time, and the prisons were veritable universities for hardcore violence. And they came out of the prisons with their new family tattooed all over their skin, and they became, MS-13 in LA. So what did the Clinton administration do? He deported 20,000 hardened criminals that might not have been criminals if we had only offered them welcome and given them opportunity. He deported them right back to a country that was trying to overcome 12 years of a needless bloody war and didn't have the structures in place to do it. And now we have gangs and cartels controlling the whole region. That was a problem we created.
Well said. Well said. Ladies, any comments or questions?
I was just going to ask Sarah. Sarah, do you address at all the problems with the court system when people have to go to court to have their asylum petitions heard? I mean, the backlog is absolutely phenomenal, but that's part of the problem, that people kind of wait around in limbo for an extended period of time, sometimes 2, 3, 5 years before their situation is heard, where they can sort of start, maybe if they want to become an American citizen. Do you address that at all?
Yes, I do, and in various ways. And I really appreciate the question, because a lot of people ask, if you could do one thing or two things or three things today to solve the issue, what would they be? And number one is always fix the asylum system, because that's already a law on the books, right? The 1988 Refugee Act has defined and determined how our system is supposed to work with regard to dealing with the newcomers who are fleeing from harm. And it's a system in place. We don't need Congress to, even discuss it. It's already on the books. But too many administrations, one after another, with Trump being the most hard-hitting, have decimated the system. They've decimated the system deliberately. Again, as a way, an end run around the Refugee Act and the 1951 Convention, as a by not appointing immigration judges, by not having enough asylum judges to do credible fear interviews at the points of entry. There are many, many ways in which, again, we created the problem by not bolstering our system when we could have. To my mind, that issue is really, I lay that issue at the feet of Obama, because in 2014, right, 2013, 2014, when we started to see a brand new phenomena, it actually started in 2008 under Bush, when children and mothers and children began to arrive at the border in unprecedented numbers. it was new. We'd never seen that before. Up to that point, it had mostly been men coming in search of work, crossing our borders. But then suddenly children and their mothers were coming. But the Bush administration built jails for families, locked them up, deported them as soon as they could. Then it happened again under Obama and Biden in 2013-14. So both of these were opportunities for us as a nation to say, wow, why are so many people on the run? We should look at the root causes. We should interrogate what responsibility we might have for having caused their displacement and force them to flee. And until we do that, until we get that sorted, we should bolster our immigration system so we can get them through the system quickly. But we didn't. We didn't. So what did we get? We got more prisons, and then we got people allowed to go free to their jurisdictions of their homes of welcome and join the backlog. And after 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 years of waiting to see a judge, and people don't want to live in the shadows, right? They don't want to live undocumented where their labor is exploited, etc., where they're having to worry all the time about being picked up and deported. They don't want that. They want to finish their cases. But when they're made to wait, guess what? They marry, they have children, they start businesses, they establish ties in their communities, so that when they are then wrenched out, they're leaving children behind. It's another form of family separation. They're creating cracks in communities that adored them and loved them. And why? Because they didn't fall under the definition of asylum that was written in 1951, before the planet became so hot, before gangs and cartels took over their homelands. So we need to also update the definition of what asylum means, but Congress, a divided Congress isn't going to do that. So for the moment, we could simply bolster our asylum system again so that it works. And one way we would need to do that is take it out of the Department of Justice.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, that should be an easy fix, but we just don't have the political will. So that's why we have to put pressure on our elected officials, get the right elected officials in and say, fix that, because you can. You do not need an act of Congress to do that.
Any further questions? Oh, closing remarks, Sarah. You really covered this very, very well. Very impressive. I certainly hope that you will expand the reach of your work. It's phenomenal work that you're doing.
Thank you.
Any final remarks that we will be in touch with the local media and elected officials and what have you. And this is well done. Well done that you've done, and it's very good. Any final remarks for us?
Well, this book was deliberately brought out by my publisher this year because it's an election year. We didn't know when she took the book on that it would be such a critical election year, but it is. So it's both a book launch and a get out the vote effort. I began in June, and I'm thrilled and exhausted to say that with every event I do, it leads to another, and sometimes 2 more. So I've been on the road since June 3rd, and at this point I have events booked all the way through November 21st. So, spread the word, share the news. I'm happy to be invited here, there, and everywhere, because my mission is not to make money, but to make change. And the best change we could hope for in the short term is to stop the monster, but then use the lame duck period to mobilize, to get educated, to create the choir that I was talking about, so that when Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are inaugurated, we say to them, you have to do better. And that Biden border bill you keep promising to enact on day 1, it's a bad bill. So let's put some humanitarian provisions on the table next to the law and order all the time opportunities that it is proposing, we need not just law and order at the border. We need to decouple the Department of Homeland Security from the immigration, the needs, the humanitarian needs of people who are coming, seeking safety. That should not be taken care of by people who have been trained in counterinsurgency tactics to crack down on the law. That should be taken care of by an entire other system that is trained with compassion to meet people and newcomers in need. We need to decouple those systems. That's my hope for the next administration.
Well,
Thank you again.
Ingrid
Yes.
wrote in the chat, thank you, Sarah, for all of the work you put into this book and for sharing it with this group.
Thank you, Ingrid. I appreciate it. I hope.
And I wanted to, oh, sorry.
I was just gonna say, I hope it's hard to say I hope you enjoy the book because it's a hard read, but I also am told that it's an easy read, even though it's a hard read, but it's readable. So I hope you find it edifying and inspiring, even if it isn't necessarily enjoyable.
Well, you may know this about Queens, but Astoria is a neighborhood in Queens, and some say that Queens is the most ethnically diverse urban area in the world.
That's what I'm told.
And no racial or ethnic group holds a majority in the borough. So you're speaking to a good group here.
I am
Tomorrow
speaking to
today.
the best group. I'm speaking to the best group. Yeah, I love Astoria. I'm from Brooklyn, so I'm not
Oh.
unfamiliar with your community. And
We won't hold that against you. Now, finally, all evening, finally, you said something that, maybe a little,
a little controversial.
I don't know, Brooklyn, we have to have a board meeting about this, but we'll no, wonderful time. We hope that you can come to a bookstore here in Queens, and we will spread the word on this. Hopefully you can get some coverage, okay?
Thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you
Okay.
so much.
Thanks
Thank
Have a
very
good
much.
Thank
Be
you,
well.
everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.